Good evening again, everyone. My name is Ian Wilson, and I serve as director of the Chester Ronning Center for the Study of Religion and Public Life. I also teach religious studies here at the University of Alberta. Welcome to this very special event, A Jewish Journey in the White House, a conversation with Sarah Hurwitz, chief speechwriter for Michelle Obama. As many of you know, the Ronning Center is located at the U of A's Augustana campus in Camrose. The campus sits in Treaty 6 territory, an area traditionally known as Siniscow-Sapesis, or Stony Creek, a meeting ground for many indigenous peoples. This land provided a traveling route and home to the Musqueam, Nehiwak, Niitsitapi, Nakota, and Tsuut'ina nations, the Métis, and other indigenous peoples. Their spiritual and practical relationships to the land create a rich heritage for our learning and our life as a community here at Augustana. Again, my name is Ian, and I will be your host tonight. Those of you familiar with Ronning Center programming know that we cover a wide variety of topics in relation to religion and public life. But it's not very often that the interests of our guests overlap with my own specific research interests. For those of you who don't know me, as you'll see on the screen here, I'm a scholar of the Bible and the history of the ancient Middle East. I'm not a Jewish studies scholar per se, but obviously the early history of Judaism is central to what I do as a researcher. And of course, both ancient and contemporary Judaism are regular topics of discussion in my religious studies classes here at Augustana. So I'm truly delighted to have Sarah Hurwitz with us this week to talk with us about her experience as a Jewish woman working in public service at the highest level in the office of the Chief Executive of the United States. Tonight's event is actually the first of two with Sarah. She will join us again tomorrow morning for another conversation at 10 a.m. Mountain Standard Time, what we've called a coffee and conversation. I know that it may not necessarily be your time for coffee, depending on the time zone, but if you're like me, you enjoy coffee pretty much any time of day. So feel free, grab a cup of coffee and join us tomorrow at 10 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. While tonight's conversation will focus mainly on Sarah's work in the White House and how that work intersected with her religious life, tomorrow's chat will focus more specifically on Judaism and Sarah's rediscovery, so to speak, of her Jewish heritage and faith, and how that journey led her to writing a book about Judaism. And of course, at both events, there will be ample opportunity for you to take part in the conversation by submitting questions for her. And just another reminder that you may submit those questions at any time during the event using the Q&A button on the Zoom app. And just one more quick bit of business before we get to the main event. If you're not already following us on social media, you can find us on Facebook, on Twitter, and on Instagram. And on our website, you can sign up for email notices as well. Many thanks, as always, to Kim Wiebe, the Center's program coordinator and administrative assistant, for her work managing all of the logistics and marketing for our events. Thanks so much, Kim. I can't see you right now, but I know you're listening, so thank you. As I mentioned, our guest this week is Sarah Hurwitz. Sarah has worked in Washington for a number of years, including as a White House speechwriter for the Obama administration from 2009 to 2017. During that time, she became First Lady Michelle Obama's chief speechwriter and worked with Mrs. Obama on some of her most memorable public addresses, including her famous "When They Go Low, We Go High" speech at the 2016 Democratic National Convention. It was also during that time that Sarah began a serious inquiry into Judaism, the faith, tradition, and culture of her family and ancestry. Sarah's inquiry got so serious that she wrote a book about it. here all along, finding meaning, spirituality, and a deeper connection to life in Judaism after finally choosing to look there, which was published by Spiegel and Grau just last year. When I heard about Sarah's work and her book, I thought, oh, I bet that's a really engaging memoir or autobiography about her religious life and her religious journey. And it is that, for sure. But it's more than that, too. The book is also a very good introduction to Judaism in general. Sarah covers huge amounts of ground in Jewish theology and practice and does so in a really effective way. The book is packed with info and insights, and unlike many introductions to religions or specific religious traditions, it is anything but tedious or boring. It is a real delight to read, and I plan on using it in some of my own teaching. I highly recommend it. But I don't want to say any more because we're going to hear from Sarah herself, of course, about her time in Washington, her engagement with Judaism, and I look forward to that conversation. So please join me in welcoming Sarah Hurwitz to this virtual gathering at the Chester Ronning Center. And I will end my screen share, and you should be able to see Sarah now. Hello, Sarah.
Hello, it's so nice to be here. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here with you, Ian, and with everyone on the Zoom tonight. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, yeah. Thanks so much. Again, it's great to have you. And I do want to say, I know we've talked about this some. I'm not a super pro with the Zoom thing, so apologies if there were rustling of my notes or anything like that. We'll do our best here. But let's jump right into our conversation. So I mentioned that you worked in the White House as a speechwriter, first for the president and then for the First Lady. We'll get to your specific experiences with the Obamas in a bit. But first, maybe you could just tell us some about how you got there. Tell us a bit about your career path, what got you into speechwriting, and public service in general, so that we can get to know you a bit just to kick things off.
Sure. You know, growing up, I always had an interest in government and politics. And when my class in 8th grade actually visited Washington, D.C., I grew up outside of Boston in Massachusetts. We visited Washington, D.C., and I just thought, I need to live here. Like, I need to come here and work in government when I'm older. So the summer after my junior year of college, I got an internship in the White House in Vice President Al Gore's speechwriting office. This was the summer of '98. And the writers who I interned for, they helped me get my first 2 jobs out of college, both of which were total failures. The first one involved a 3-hour round trip commute, and I sat in a windowless cubicle next to a bathroom and was miserable, so I left. The second one, after about a year, it was speechwriting for a United States senator. And after about a year, his chief of staff sat me down and said, you know, I hear you've applied to law school. You should go. That sounds like a really good job for you, because I was 22. I barely knew how to speechwrite. I'm still not sure why they hired me. So I went to law school. In my 3rd week of class, I met a guy named Josh Gottheimer, who is now a member of the United States House of Representatives. But back then, he was just a classmate of mine in law school. And before law school, he had been a speechwriter for President Clinton. So we met in law school, we're both students, but we just started freelance speechwriting together just for various corporate and nonprofit clients, just to make money for law school. And Josh really taught me how you structure a speech and how you write to be heard rather than read, which are 2 very different skills. So Josh and I, we then got jobs on a presidential primary campaign in 2003, and the candidate lost. We got jobs on a presidential campaign for John Kerry in 2004, and Kerry lost. I then got hired as Hillary Clinton's chief speechwriter in 2008 on her presidential campaign, and she too lost. So at this point, we have 2 failed jobs, 3 losing campaigns, which is not an amazing record. And fortunately, the Obama campaign was very kind to hire me as a speechwriter for then Senator Obama. And so I joined the campaign, and he actually won, which is a new experience for me and very exciting. So I got to go to the White House with him. But while I was on the campaign, I had helped Mrs. Obama with her 2008 Democratic Convention speech, probably her really biggest speech she had given so far in her life. And we got to know each other and just really hit it off. This was a speech that came at a time when she was really getting some very negative press back in 2008, a lot of which I think was pretty racist and sexist. It was, oh, she's an angry Black woman, she doesn't love America, really quite upsetting, and totally unfair. And this speech was a moment where she really got to present herself to the American people unfiltered. And so working with her on that was a really intense experience and a really wonderful one. But when we went to the White House, again, I was there to write for him. And after a couple of years, I just decided that I missed writing for her. And I was more at home in her voice. And so I made a very unusual White House career move of moving from writing for the president to being the chief speechwriter for the first lady. And that's how I got the job. A lot of failure, basically. The bottom line there, I think.
Yeah. Well, it takes a lot of failures, I think, before we have successes. What was that like in the White House? Like when you said, "Oh, I'm going to leave the president and I'm going to work specifically for the first lady from here forward." Were there weird responses to that, or was it mostly like, "Oh, that's a good move," or how did people respond to that?
I think people were a little bit confused because that is the opposite direction that people usually go. People usually go from the first lady and they kind of almost get like a promotion to the president. And so I think people wondered, like, why are you going the other way? That doesn't make a lot of sense. Especially this is back in 2010, 2011, when Mrs. Obama hadn't developed her platform and her profile to the extent that she did today. So I think, a lot of people now are like, oh, what a genius move. Of course you went to write for her, she was this. But, back then, I think my colleagues, I think my colleagues were like, are you okay? What's going on? I think the president was a little confused at first, but then, he was very gracious about it. And, the reality is, like, I was an okay speechwriter for him. I think I would have continued to be an okay kind of mediocre speechwriter for him because I just never quite felt at home in his voice. But I was a really good speechwriter for her because I felt at home in her voice. We had connected. I was just the right fit for her. And so I'm really glad I made that move, even though it was a little bit counterintuitive.
Yeah. That's an interesting point, thinking about kind of finding someone else's voice and like merging your two voices. And we'll get to that, actually. I want to talk about that some later, specifically in relation to your religious life and spiritual journey. But what was it like working with the Obamas? So, I'm sure many people listening have read Becoming, Mrs. Obama's really excellent autobiography from a couple of years ago. And President Obama just came out with the first book of his 2-volume memoirs. And so I'm sure some people listening are digging into that. But so there's lots of ways for us to kind of hear their perspectives of being in the White House. But what was it like for you? Give us some of the inside dirt, so to speak, on what it was like working in the White House.
Yeah, working for, I'll talk about Mrs. Obama just because I worked for her the longest. She is someone who knows who she is, and she always knows what she wants to say. And that is the greatest blessing that you can have as a speechwriter, because sometimes you get people who are like, I don't know what I want. Give me something to react to. I don't know. Okay, now it's the day before the speech. I don't like this. Let's start over. Let's send drafts to 20 people and have each of them write a bit. It's like, it can be very chaotic and very unpleasant. But Mrs. Obama, she just knew herself, and she's such a naturally gifted speaker and writer. So the way it worked for me to write for her is, a week or so before the speech, I would sit down with her and members of her team and say, what do you want to say? You have this upcoming speech. Where's your head at? And she would just dictate paragraphs and paragraphs of excellent language, themes, ideas, stories. Just like entire paragraphs. And I would actually have my laptop in the meeting and I would type as fast as possible because I really wanted to capture verbatim what she was saying. For example, when they go low, we go high. That was her line. I didn't write that line. She came up with it and I typed it into my laptop. And, once I got that initial download from her, that really formed the beating heart of the draft. So I would go back to my office, I would weave it into a draft, and I'd incorporate maybe, if it was a college graduation speech, university graduation speech, I would have done research on the university, its history, its student body. So I would, enhance the speech with that kind of information. And then I would take the draft and circulate it to probably 40 or 50 people in the White House, lawyers, fact checkers, policy people, communications people. The Obamas were very concerned about always telling the American people the truth, about making sure that everything they said was accurate, that it was sensitive, that it was helpful. And so we had a really rigorous vetting process, which, you spend as a speechwriter, you spend a lot of your time negotiating with people. The policy person will say, she has to say all 18 points of this policy. And I'd be like, it's a speech to 13-year-olds. Like, no, she doesn't. Like, but so, you have a debate, right? You kind of go back and forth. And so after that process, I would then send her the draft, and then she would edit. She would line edit. I'd get the edits, I'd put them in, I'd edit some more, she'd edit, I'd edit back and forth, and then she would deliver it. And, I have to say, I got to travel with her oftentimes when she was speaking, and it was such a joy. I think if I asked the people on the Zoom call tonight, who is the spouse of the leader, president, prime minister of Ghana, Japan, Mexico, do any of you know? I don't know, right? I don't know the spouses of world leaders, maybe a handful. But everywhere we went in the world, people knew who the Obamas were. We would go places and people would be lining the streets, just like waving American flags and cheering. Mrs. Obama, she loves children. Like, she's just, young people were just the heart of her work in the White House. So we would always spend time in schools and community centers, and these kids would be like crying and screaming and wanting to hug her. They knew her story, which was really quite moving, like all around the world. I think especially in places like Africa, where there was just a sense that there's a sense of identification, and also just around the world, a sense that the Obamas were people who came from very modest backgrounds and worked their way up, right? They'd kind of lived the American dream. And so just the joy of being able to present that kind of face of America to the world, the face of these decent, kind, compassionate, brilliant, educated, thoughtful people, I felt very proud. I felt like we were really presenting a really great face of America to the world back then. And, I feel such gratitude for having been part of that.
Yeah. I will try to refrain making comments like this, but what you're doing is very touching, considering what the 4 years that we have just lived through seems to be the polar opposite of what you're describing in terms of concern for the truth and fact checking and presenting oneself as a presentable person to the rest of the world.
Yes, it's been a long 4 years, very, very long 4 years, which is ending soon. So that's good.
Yeah. Thankfully. Well, thanks for sharing a bit about that process. There's a really great story in the book, which is really great. I know I said that in my kind of scripted notes at the beginning, but off the cuff here, I will say again that it really is an excellent book. And there's this great story in the book where you are meeting up with a group of colleagues for a happy hour drink after work. And they're talking about you. So you walk into this conversation that's already started and hey guys, what's up? And they're talking about the afterlife. And at this point in your life, you've been thinking really deeply and intensely about Judaism, and you assume they're talking about the afterlife, right? What happens after we die. But actually, they're talking about what they're hoping to do with their lives after 2016, after the Obama administration wraps up, and they have to move on in their careers. And so I really loved that story. I don't know, it made me laugh, and it was funny just to think about the different headspaces that you and your colleagues were in at that moment. So now you're in the afterlife, so to speak, post White House. As I said in my intro, we'll talk some more tomorrow about your kind of journey in learning more about Judaism and rediscovering Judaism. But when you left your position in the White House, what made you decide to write this book? Could you tell us some about how you entered into this particular afterlife in the here and now?
Right. No, I think it was quite surprising to many of my colleagues. And actually, towards the end of the administration, I reached out to a political pundit just to get advice. And I told her I was thinking of writing this book on Judaism. And she said, oh, no. That is not your first book after leaving the White House. Your first book should be about politics or speechwriting or Michelle Obama. And then you can write that weird book that no one will ever read. Like, it was a little harsh. And by the way, also good advice, right? Writing a book to, 2% of the American population it's a tough sell, not gonna lie. Although I do intend my book to be for a wide audience. People of all backgrounds have told me, a lot of Christians, a lot of very atheist people, a lot of just people of every background has been like, this book was really for me, which is interesting. But I don't think she really understood that. So, I grew up with a pretty kind of minimal Jewish background. I did go to Hebrew school, which is like Sunday school for Jews. And we went to, our synagogue for the main holidays. And I found that kind of boring. I didn't really love Hebrew school. So by the time I had my bat mitzvah, which is the Jewish coming of age ceremony at age 13, I kind of felt like this is enough. I'm like a cultural Jew. I'm a Jew by heritage, but if I want to find meaning and spirituality and connection, I'll really have to look elsewhere. So fast forward 25 years later, at the age of 36, I broke up with a guy I'd been dating, and I just had a lot of time on my hands that I was looking to fill. And I happened to hear about an introduction to Judaism class at the local Jewish community center. And I really just signed up thinking, okay, I should learn something about my heritage. I know almost nothing about Judaism. I should be better educated about my own tradition. Didn't have very high expectations, but what I learned in that class really blew me away. I found just so much wisdom about what it means to be human, about what it means to live a good and worthy and meaningful life, what it means to be a decent and good person, what it means to find profound spiritual connection, beyond some idea of like God is a man in the sky who controls things and punishes us, which I still don't believe, didn't believe then, still don't, but there was a lot of very sophisticated theology and spirituality here. And I thought, where's this been all my life? So I started learning, and I read hundreds of books. I started attending silent Jewish meditation retreats. And I found that the books out there tended to be either nuts and bolts intro books, which were great, but very basic, or they were these highly academic, esoteric books, which I just found excruciating. So I thought, like, where's the book for me, right? Where I want the book where someone has taken, looked into this tradition and really compiled the most transformative, radical, relevant, life-changing wisdom that will help us live better lives today, help us cope with our struggles, help us be better people, help us find profound connection with something higher, whether you're Jewish or any background, it really doesn't matter. Like, where's that book? And that was the book I just decided to write.
And what made you decide to skip? So I'm wondering why you passed on the quote unquote good advice of your colleague who said, you need to write a book about the Obamas or the speechwriting career or whatever. So why did you ultimately decide that wasn't the path for you?
I just had no interest in doing it.
Yeah.
Just none whatsoever. I just, like, the thought of doing it filled me with dread, and it made my heart sink. And I just thought, and I knew it was very good advice, right? If I'd written a book called, titled How to Speechwrite, How to Give Speeches Like Michelle Obama, that would have sold quite well, right? There's no question, but I just didn't want to write that book. And so, and it would have been much easier than writing a book about Judaism where I really had to immerse myself deeply in this 4,000-year tradition. I mean, as you know, my book has 550 endnotes, most of which are to ancient texts. Even though it's sort of a fun conversational kind of, it's like we're chatting, it's very informal, but I needed to do the research to make sure I knew what I was talking about. So it was not the easy route, but it was just what I felt called to do.
Yeah, so maybe not the good choice in terms of career steps or whatever, but what you needed to do and what you had been immersed in too for quite some time leading up to that moment.
And what I often tell, because we're at a university, I often tell students, it's very easy to get kind of pulled along by what other people think is impressive, by what other people, it's sort of easy to live your life by looking externally and seeing what impresses others. But at some point you can really start to feel like you're swimming against the tide of your life. And I just, writing the impressive book just felt like swimming against the tide. I kind of knew where I wanted to go, and I took the risk that it might be a disaster, and it wasn't, thankfully, but it could have been. So
it's certainly not a disaster, I think, and it fills that void that you mentioned between a kind of just basic, very nuts and bolts kind of intro and the heady academic stuff, which even as an academic, I hate myself. So I think
it's tough. I mean, there's good stuff in there. You just have to really be committed to untangling it, which is tough.
Yeah, and your book, I think, it's very learned and very well researched, but also very readable and really gets into the heady stuff in an introductory kind of way, if that makes sense. That's really effective. So speaking about the book, in there, and there's many chapters we could kind of dig into, but there's one in particular that's really poignant on ethics and on Jewish ethical traditions. And in there, you talk about how you were a good person, or you've always thought of yourself as a good person, but that studying Jewish ethics made you realize that you weren't really a great person. So could you tell us some about how your study of Jewish ethics has impacted, well, just the way you interact with others generally. But also, could you contextualize that a bit some in the context of working in DC? I've never worked in politics myself, but I imagine there are great ethical challenges at every political turn, and that you probably are encountered with many gray areas and questions and issues that are not easily answered or confronted. So how did you manage those kinds of challenges in politics day in and day out? And how did Judaism inform your ethics in your career in Washington?
Yeah, I think you're right. Like, I really did think like, oh, I'm a good person. I don't lie, cheat, or steal. I'm kind. I try to be a good friend. But that's actually a pretty low bar, right? Like, I think a lot of us are influenced of the ethic. There's sort of an ethic of modern life, which is like, do whatever you want as long as you don't hurt other people too much. That might be more American. I think Canadians have more of a communal ethic, but in America, I think that is the sort of predominant ethic. Which, reflects our individualism. And look, that's fine for a secular set of laws. I don't want the government imposing morality on me, but it's also a very low bar, right? There's nothing there about compassion, kindness, generosity, self-sacrifice, self-restraint. These are deeper ethics. And so once I started studying Judaism, I was really moved by how high the bar was and by how intricate and specific the law is. Like, oftentimes it sort of frustrates me when people say, when I hear Jews say, oh, to me, Jewish values are about social justice and helping those who are struggling. It's like, every religion says that. And every decent secular person says that. But Judaism actually has a very specific approach, and kind of the devil's in the details with Judaism, meaning, actually, that's probably a bad phrase, but the heart is in the details. And what I mean by that is, when you look at the Jewish laws about how you help those who are in financial need, it doesn't just say give money to those who are financially struggling. It tells you like exactly how to do it and how much. And so, there's all these laws about making sure that you don't humiliate people, right? So it's like, it urges you to give anonymously. It urges you that if you've made a loan to someone and you see them coming down the street, you should actually avoid them if you know that they can't pay it back, because you don't want to embarrass them, right? You don't want to remind them that they're indebted to you. There's actually a Jewish law that says that even people who are in financial need and they receive assistance, they actually have to give a little bit to someone else as well, because it doesn't want anyone to just feel like a taker. It wants people to feel empowered. And you sometimes hear this old lie that, Christianity is a religion of love and Judaism is a religion of law. And that really misunderstands what Jewish law is. Jewish law is actually how we reflect love. Like, when I am taking the moment to say, oh, wait a second, I see that person, he owes me money and I know he can't pay it back. I care about him. I care about his feelings. I'm going to walk away so that I don't surprise him, right? I don't embarrass him. There's a real sensitivity to the needs of others. And I think that's how we enact love in Judaism, that ethic is very powerful. And, I think when you think about the world of Washington, D.C., it's like, you can certainly create a school lunch program that provides free lunches for children from low-income backgrounds. But if it's set up in a way that humiliates them, if they have to announce to the cashier in front of everyone, oh, I'm on the free lunch. Well, I guess that you're giving them the food they need, but you're singling them out and making them embarrassed. So it's actually, I almost think that ethic of exquisite sensitivity to the needs and the dignity of others is quite powerful in the realm of policymaking as well. I also think about, there's a huge emphasis in Judaism on the word you use, on speech, a lot of emphasis about not shaming people, about not gossiping. And that's something I often thought about in government, because look, it's a very stressful place to work. The White House is very stressful, and my colleagues were wonderful and like my family, but there were moments where we got frustrated with each other. And you could see a situation where I get frustrated with my colleague Bob. We have a fight. I'm so frustrated, and I go to the lunchroom and I complain about Bob to 5 different people. I say that he's lazy, I don't trust him, he's bad at his job, he's mean. And then I feel better. It's like, okay, good. And then we go back, and then Bob and we apologize, right? We make up. It was all a misunderstanding. We're sorry. Okay, well, I've just told a bunch of people some pretty bad things about Bob, and maybe other people they've told other people, and maybe Bob applies for a job in one of those departments in a month, and someone says, oh, you know what? I heard about that guy. Let's just hold on him, right? In a moment of kind of carelessness with my speech, a moment of anger, I really did some damage to his livelihood and his life. So I think Judaism has made me think a lot more about how I use my speech. And I think finally, there's this Jewish idea of chesed, which is Hebrew for loving kindness, which really, it demands a kind of a deep presence by us for others who are struggling. So when someone is ill, when they are in mourning after losing a loved one, Judaism tells us, like, don't just send a text, don't just send flowers. Like, you actually need to physically show up at their bedside. You need to like physically show up at the funeral and really just be there for them in a very embodied way. And, obviously in time of COVID, that is not possible. No one should do that. But I do still think that ministry of presence is demanded of us. Like this very, you can do it by Zoom, phone, outside, socially distanced, but that real showing up for people in times of need. So those are all things that I've just, I've really thought a lot about, especially, Washington, D.C. is a tough town. And I think I've just realized over and over again how important it is to be present for the people I work with, to support others. And I think that's something that we really, the Obama White House, like, these people are my family. I think any of us could call any of us, and it's like, what do you need? How can I help? I'm here for you. And I think that to me just reminds me of what I've learned when studying Jewish ethics.
So you mentioned the challenge of being physically present, for example, with a friend or a loved one who may be celebrating joys or struggling with traumas or illness or whatever in these COVID times. And I know we talked the other day, you haven't left DC since March or something.
That's correct. Yes.
I've hardly left my basement in Alberta. I get to be in my office tonight for a special university event, but I've hardly left my house. How have you reached out to those in your community? How have you been able to live that Jewish ethic that you're talking about in these times? I mean, you mentioned Zoom and things, but do you have any kind of specific stories or anything about how, maybe thinking through some of these ethics and these, these particular Jewish ethical traditions, how have maybe made you rethink your COVID life over Zoom or whatever?
Yeah, it's, I've been doing a lot of I have regular Shabbat dinners with friends. We do it outside, 6 feet apart, wearing masks except for when we're eating. So it's cold. I'm not gonna lie, it's cold, and it's it's not as comfortable as the old way, but we're present, right? We sort of decided to make this commitment and just make it work. I also think I've seen people be very creative about Jewish traditions. So there's a Jewish tradition that at a funeral, after the funeral ends, the people who've come to the funeral, they line up in 2 lines, and the mourners, the people who've lost a loved one, they walk through the 2 lines, the 2 receiving lines, and the people in the lines kind of shower them with condolences. Just tell them sorry. And so it's really a beautiful representation of your community surrounding you, walking you through this next stage of grief. And I heard about a woman in Texas, in the United States, who had lost her husband to COVID. They've been married for 30 years. It was right during a lockdown, so they couldn't have a traditional funeral. They couldn't do any of the rituals, and she was quite devastated. She's really needing the support of her community. And what they decided to do is the community people drove their cars to the synagogue parking lot. They lined their cars up in 2 lines, and then she and her family, who were in mourning, drove their car through these 2 lines of cars, and people waved, they blew kisses, and that's actually really, that is, I think that's really, they've really touched into the beating heart of the law, right? It doesn't look exactly the way that the ancient rabbis who came up with this stuff 2,000 years ago were contemplating, but it serves the same purpose. So I think that kind of creativity where you're really capturing the spirit of it, even if it's in a different form, is very important right now during COVID.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see what, how obviously traditions change. So to see how things shift after these times, and what sorts of traditions remain the same, what sorts are tweaked and have to, shift as we go forward. So this next question, I guess it's a little more lighthearted. So it's a bit of a segue. It might be a terrible segue, but I'm just going to go with my initial thought.
Go with it.
Flow. It does have to do with ethical challenges in a way. So what, maybe you could share with us some of the craziest, or one of the craziest moments you had working in the White House, which maybe presented an ethical challenge, or maybe got you thinking about your Jewish faith because you were stressed to the hilt or whatever. I don't know. But yeah, what's a crazy kind of White House story,
Sure.
working moment for us?
So I will actually tell you 2. One was a very harrowing near miss. So I'll do that one first, then we can end on the happier note with the second one. So in 2016, Mrs. Obama was traveling to Japan, and she was traveling there to announce this new partnership between the United States government and the government of Japan to promote global education for girls, to promote girls' education around the world. That was something in developing countries. So we were going to do that together with their government. And so I thought it would be really nice to end the speech that Mrs. Obama was giving to announce this partnership with the government of Japan. I thought it'd be nice to end it with a Japanese proverb. So I did a lot of research, and I finally found a proverb that said, "No road is long with a good companion." I thought, okay, this is brilliant, right? Like, I wrote this whole flowery ending, like, the challenge of global education will be hard, but with our wonderful companion, the government of Japan, the road won't be long. I mean, this whole big ending. I felt very proud of myself. But then, we have very rigorous fact checking. So in addition to our fact checkers signing off on it, I sent it to the American Embassy in Japan just to make sure. I just wanted them to look at it, but it was pretty innocuous. A couple of hours later, I get a call from the deputy chief of mission, who is literally second in line to the ambassador. And he says to me, "We got to talk about that proverb." I actually think I said to him, "Come on, man. It's a proverb about friendship. You guys are anti-friendship over there in Japan? Like, come on." And he was not pleased with that. And he said, "Okay." And, he said, "I'm going to put you on the phone with a member of the local staff." And every American embassy around the world has staff from the country where they are. So the American embassy in Japan has Japanese staff who work there. They help with language and cultural issues. So he puts this woman on the phone, and she says to me, "Look, Sarah, I understand that you think that this is a beautiful proverb about friendship, but you need to understand that in Japanese culture, this is understood to be a proverb about suicide." Like, I'm sorry, what? And she went into this very long, elaborate explanation as to why this is the case, which I don't remember because I think I was just so shocked. I couldn't even, I wasn't even listening. So I then had to go back to the first lady and be like, "Funny story about that proverb at the end.
Totally
take it out." I was like, it just doesn't quite work. And, she was great sport about it, like she always was. But I just thought, good thing I checked that, right? So that was one story, near miss. Another story actually took place in 2009 when I was writing for President Obama, and I wrote his first university graduation speech, which was at the Arizona State University. And, we met with him several weeks in advance to discuss the speeches, but this was 2009 when the US economy was on the brink of a Great Depression. He was really busy and trying to save us from spiraling into despair. So he just wasn't that focused in the meeting, and he dictated some ideas, but I could tell he just was distracted. So I felt like, okay, I'll just, these are good ideas. I'll go write a speech based on them. So I did, gave it to him a week in advance, heard nothing. And then the morning of the speech, I get a call saying, "The president wants to see you in the Oval Office." I just thought, that is not good, right? He is not inviting me in to be like, "Good job, Tiger, you nailed it." Like that was not what was happening. So I rushed to get dressed. I'm all frazzled. I run into the office, and we sit down, and he says, "Well, look, sorry, but I didn't get to look at this until late last night, and this just isn't the speech I want to give today." I thought, okay, that's bad. I spent 9 days writing that speech, but all right, time to write a new one in the next 9 hours. No problem, right? So I was like, "Okay, sir, what would you like to talk about?" And he just started dictating an entirely different speech, no resemblance to the first one. I thought, this is not good. So I run back to my office, I'm frantically rewriting, and my colleagues are helping me. It's like totally just this mad dash. After a few hours, I have some semblance of a new draft. I send it to him. He says, "Okay, this is getting there, but it's too much like the old draft." And he gave me more feedback, so I'm frantically writing. And I realized I'm just running out of time. And the motorcade that takes, the group of cars that take staff from the White House to Air Force One, it's about to leave, and it leaves about an hour before the president because it takes longer to go by car, and the president goes by helicopter. So I called our schedulers and I said, "I'm going to miss the motorcade. I need more time." And they said, "No problem. We'll get you on the helicopter." So, bought me another 45 minutes. I'm working. Finally, it's time to get on the helicopter, and I'm like, running across the South Lawn with like my laptop and papers everywhere. So we get into the Marine One, the helicopter, which is just tiny inside. My knees are practically touching the president, which is very awkward. And I'm sort of hunched over, working on the speech. And he looks over at me, he goes, "What are you doing?" We're flying over the Washington Monument. And he says, "What are you doing? Like, stop editing the speech. Look out. Enjoy the view. When are you going to get to see something like this?" And I was like,
You're on the
really?
president's helicopter.
Exactly. He was like, which is just, it says so much about his, first of all, his kindness, right? That he knows this is a very special thing for staff to get to do and he wanted me to enjoy it. And just his unflappability. He never seemed concerned at all. Throughout it, never seemed concerned. So we get to the plane. On the plane, I'm still rewriting the speech. The computers on Air Force One back in 2009 were quite slow. So I would like hit a key and it would take a second for the letter to appear on the screen, which was making me insane.
Yeah.
Finally we're landing. I'm trying to print. It's taking forever. We've taxied and stopped. The trip director is like standing over my shoulder being like, get off the plane, get off the plane. You need to get off the plane. You're going to miss the motorcade. And I'm trying to get out. I finally get off the plane, run into the cars. We're traveling to the university and we're still editing the speech in the motorcade. I'm just thinking, yeah, this is not going to be good. It's like, you know what? I always tell younger speechwriters who I work with, I just say, it's once in a while, in a speech that's just not going well, you just get to the point where it doesn't have to be good, but it does have to be done. And I was like, I think we're at this point now. So this just needs to be done. It's going to be a disaster and I'm just going to march through it. And this is what's happening. So we get there, he steps up to the podium and he delivers that speech like he's been giving it every day for his entire life. Just this flawless, passionate, excellent delivery. Over the course of the day, we've been working on it and he had all these great ideas, all these great lines and language. It actually turned out to be a great speech. I just thought, like, who would have guessed?
Yeah.
You never have the day you think you're going to have in the White House. And, I think I learned over the years that you have to just have faith in your experience, in your skill, and in the people you write for. And I have a lot of faith in the Obamas. And I think that was one of many examples when that faith was proven. So, definitely a stressful day.
Yes. Yeah. Well, a couple of comments. One, as a teacher, I can somewhat relate. I mean, it's a much different level than the president. But yeah, you have some of these classes you've prepared or days where you just think nothing's going to go right. And then you go in there and it works out just fine. And often those are your best days. But the other comment that popped in my head was, that just sounds like a nightmare to me as an academic who works on papers to present at conferences, not political speeches, but still, I have friends who write their papers on the planes to conferences and things, and or finish their paper as they're sitting on the panel waiting to get up and talk. And I just cannot function like that. So imagining, one, the stress that you've gone through for days leading up to this moment. And then two, the president getting this speech literally at the very last minute, but then just getting up there and giving it as if it's no big deal. All of that makes my heart race just thinking about it.
Me too.
But this is good because thinking about this process of speech writing, which sounds like such a roller coaster. I mean, you work for days in advance, doing research, prepping. Getting kind of structure for the speech, getting initial language, and then you can be hammering out edits literally till the last second. You worked closely with Mrs. Obama in particular. And I said earlier, I wanted to kind of get back to this issue of kind of finding your voice and finding her voice and kind of merging those together. It's really interesting to me that at this point in your career, you are also kind of discovering Judaism or rediscovering Judaism. Mrs. Obama, of course, is a Christian, has been outspoken about her own Christian faith and her family's faith. So I'm curious how that merging of the voices, so to speak, how that worked for you and for Mrs. Obama. How did your journey with Judaism through those years impact your speech writing? But then also, how did Mrs. Obama's faith and her, and of course, I'm not asking you to speak for her, but just what is your knowledge of how your different faith journeys and experiences kind of merged in that speech writing process? That's a really fascinating thing, I think.
Yeah, and what's interesting about speech writing is that it's really not about two voices merging. It's really about the writer channeling the principal's voice, right? It wasn't about my voice and Mrs. Obama's voice merging, because that's my job was really to just channel her voice, right? It was to sort of get her voice in my head, which I did. Over the course of years, I just got so much feedback from her, and I heard her so much that even as I was writing for her, I would sort of hear her voice saying like, okay, Sarah, this transition's a little sloppy, we got to tighten that up, or like, okay, this is getting bogged down in the weeds, like what's the beating heart, what's the story, what are the values, how are we moving people here? Right? I would just hear her voice, and I really internalized kind of her sensibility. So it was actually when I started writing my own book, I actually had a transition period where I kind of struggled to like get my own voice. I kind of struggled to kind of, speak in my own voice. It was sort of hard for me to like untangle that and to kind of find my own unique voice, because I'd been writing in her voice for 8 years. So that was a big, challenge. And I think in terms of our values, it's funny, I was talking to someone recently who is kind of serving in a role as a chaplain. And I said to her, you must encounter patients or people you talk to who aren't religious. That must be, do they ever kind of bristle at you coming into their hospital rooms? And she says, oh yeah, all the time. People will say like, oh, you're from the chaplain's office. No. Like I don't do religion. And she said, my response to them is like, oh, that's okay. I'm not here because I care that whether you have any religious tradition or faith tradition. I'm here because you're a human being and I'm a human being. And that's why we're here. And I'm just here to be with you as like another human being at a moment when you're in pain right now. So that's it. And I just remember, I think that is, that definition of the spiritual endeavor. It's quite broad. Like I think all religious traditions have particular concerns with, how do we support and care for each other deeply? How do we care for our environment? How do we conduct ourselves and kind of in terms of our ethics, our business affairs, all of these things. And so, when I think about her values around all of that, they're like kind of identical to mine, right? Like even if she, even if her faith tradition is different, I think the core fundamental values are just so similar. Her belief in compassion, her passion about helping those who are struggling and those who feel like they're outside. I think one of the things, the first lady job is kind of it's a little bit outdated, to be totally honest. I think once we have a woman president, and I hope that happens soon, and once we have a woman president, and if that woman happens to be married to a man, I think we're going to see in pretty stark relief how outdated this job is, but that hasn't happened yet, soon, hopefully. But, she's this incredible woman with this amazing career, and she very just gracefully came in and made it her own. So, the job of a first lady is to host these very fancy cultural events, whether like, Yo-Yo Ma or Alvin Ailey Dance Company, or these very fancy people will come to the White House at 7 p.m. and perform. And I remember, she was like, oh, sure, yep, we'll do that. But I'm going to ask those performers to come 10 hours earlier, and they're going to conduct workshops for kids from inner city DC and Chicago and LA. These kids are going to come from all over the country, and I want them to be kids who are, really have very few advantages. And I want them to come to the White House, and I want them to feel like they own the place. I just want them to walk around feeling like it is their house, because it is. Because it is. Their tax money, their family's tax money pays for this house. It is their house, and they should feel like they own the place. And that's what we're going to do here. And I think that sensibility, so you would walk through the East Wing and there'd be like little children in like, tutus running through or lugging instruments. It was totally adorable. But I think that's sort of, there's a real sense of concern for the stranger, the outsider, the widow, the orphan, the poor, that informs her sensibility. And that is the very sensibility that I share as a committed Jew. So I think it was just a very good fit in a lot of ways.
Awesome. Yeah, it sounds like a really wonderful working relationship. I know that she's always, just viewing her on television and reading her book and so on has struck me as an amazing person. So it's good to have that confirmation from an insider.
She's really, she's relentlessly authentic. She's relentlessly authentic. She's just someone who's sort of constitutionally not able to lie, right? She's just someone who just doesn't have it in her to be something other than what she is. And I think, a lot of people would say, oh, she seems so authentic. It's like, no. That's who she is. She's not going to put on an act. That's just who she is. And I think that was a very good lesson to me about, oftentimes the easiest thing to do is just live your truth. The hardest thing to do is construct this elaborate facade based on what you think will be politically what. It's like, that's exhausting and really unsustainable. And she never did that. She was just always kind of herself.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing these insights about, working in the White House, but also some about your own journey. We got some good discussion there about Jewish ethics, and we'll continue this conversation tomorrow, of course. But we've reached the end of my particular questions for you this evening. But we do have a number of questions that have come in through the Q&A box, which I've mentioned multiple times, and I'll mention again now. You can continue to send in questions. We have some time here at the end. We'll try to get through as many as we can. So those of you in the audience, feel free to continue submitting questions. We've got a number here, so I'll just go ahead and start at the top. So this is from an audience member named Joshua, and he's asking about law in the Hebrew Bible. So he mentions Levitical law. And curious what your take is on how you translate, so to speak, this ancient law, especially law from the Bible, into modern society. So what's your take on that interpretive challenge?
Yeah, so I think sometimes people look at what Christians call the Old Testament, what Jews call the Tanakh, and they think, well, how can people have this as their core sacred text? This is filled with some beautiful things, but some really terrible things. And I think that what they don't understand is that Jews aren't living by a literal surface reading of this 2,500-year-old text. To do so would be absurd. We've actually spent the last 2,500 years reinterpreting it, right? There's been 2,500 years of commentary and interpretation that kind of shape our understanding. So, the line "an eye for an eye" in the Old Testament, Jews don't believe that literally, or we'd all be blind, right? That was reinterpreted about 2,000 years ago by rabbis who said, no. What that means is that if you put someone's eye out, you have to compensate them with money to make up for their loss and their pain. There's actually a number of things like that where, something that looks on the surface like it's 2,500 years old. It reflects the mores and standards of its time. And also a lot of it was quite progressive for its time. But, we've reinterpreted it to make it, to have it reflect the kind of moral progress that we make. So the rabbis reinterpreted eye for an eye 2,000 years ago. Since then, we've reinterpreted a great many of these laws. We understand them kind of differently. So today, in the kind of Judaism that 90% of American Jews practice, basically every branch of American Judaism except for Orthodoxy ordains gay rabbis, marries gay couples. Women have been able to be rabbis for many decades, right? And I would say, again, the Judaism that 90% of American Jews practice has really gotten rid of any gender distinctions, where there really isn't any different between how men and women are regarded in the sort of synagogue and rabbinic community. So, it's actually a little bit like how we understand the American Constitution. The original version of the U.S. Constitution permitted slavery and didn't allow, women were not allowed to vote. And that reflected the ethics of the time, and it reflected the prevailing thinking 250 years ago. But we've spent 250 years reinterpreting this document. So, 100 years ago, women got the right to vote. 170 years ago, 60 years ago, we outlawed slavery. We're still dealing with the legacies of these issues for sure. We still have a lot of work to do, but, we've continued to reinterpret these documents. So it's actually similar with how we understand the Bible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually another plug for the book, your chapter on Jewish interpretation and your description and introduction of the Talmud, for example, in your book is really excellent. So for those of you wanting to hear more of Sarah's opinions, actually I have some conversation topic on this issue tomorrow in mind as well. But yeah, the book is really great. And, when I think a lot of folks who don't know Judaism very well or don't know much about it, don't really understand how important the Talmud has been in Jewish history and tradition. And and your discussion of the page and how the different sections are laid out and how the order of them is very important for thinking about the history of that tradition is really great too. So,
right. Yeah. The Talmud, it's these ancient commentaries that rabbis were creating, basically from the year 70 to the year roughly 600, where they were reinterpreting the Old Testament. And then since then, other rabbis and scholars came along and interpreted their interpretations. Other people have reinterpreted their interpretations. It's this sort of ongoing conversation of people between the ages, just re-understanding this. And this is what's allowed Judaism to survive. If we were kind of stuck to some literalistic reading of a 2,500-year-old document, we would have died out. I mean, that's just not sustainable. And it's actually similar to the American Constitution. Thank God we weren't stuck to the original understanding of our Constitution. We'd still have slavery. I wouldn't be able to vote. We had to progress morally, and we had to breathe new life into these documents in each new era. And that's something I love about Judaism, is that we've continued to do that.
Yeah, it really has been 2000 plus years of an ongoing conversation and discussion and questioning and more questioning. So, so you mentioned a minute ago the different branches of North American Judaism. And so Debbie from the audience has asked if you're involved in any particular branch, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, Reconstructionist, and which one, if you have one, she asks, and why that particular one. And also Debbie's curious too, if you keep kosher, why or why not?
Yeah, these are great questions. I love questions like this. So about 30% of American Jews don't consider themselves members of any denomination, and I'm one of those 30%. I don't sort of affiliate with any denomination. The truth is there's actually things about every denomination that really speak to me and things that really don't. So I think that each of them brings something really great to the table. I look at the Reform movement and I think just the progressivism of that movement. They've always been at the very forefront of, ordaining women, ordaining gay rabbis, marrying gay people, a really deep social justice tradition that I love. So there's a lot I love about that. I really appreciate the rigor of the Orthodox tradition, the seriousness, the way that Orthodox Jews celebrate Shabbat, or that just the people who take Shabbat seriously, I shouldn't say just Orthodox, people who take Shabbat seriously, many of whom are Orthodox, they celebrate Shabbat, which is the weekly Sabbath. It's quite beautiful, right? It's a really rigorous disconnecting from the everyday kind of working world and creating a space that's just totally different. So I admire that. I think the conservative movement has a really wonderful blend of progressivism and rigor that I respect. I like each of them, but none of them feels like it's completely home to me. And I think that's becoming increasingly common. You're seeing a lot of, in the US, you're seeing a lot of non-denominational synagogues. I think that's kind of almost the wave of the future. In terms of, do I keep kosher? I don't eat pork or shellfish, and that's about it. So that's, I certainly wouldn't call that a rigorous kosher practice by any, it's not really a rigorous kashrut practice, but for me, it's just a reminder to myself when I am eating out, when I was traveling in the White House, whatever it is, it was a reminder to myself about just being a Jew. Like it was just, and traveling on the White House airplanes, it's the military. The food is a lot of the White House functions are run by the military, and so the Air Force One is obviously run by the Air Force. And these are kind of military meals, right? They're serious, they're substantive, like they're kind of used to feeding soldiers. So there was a lot of pork products featured quite heavily in them. So there were a number of times when I would say like, hey, I don't eat pork. Can I get something different? And that was, it feels important to me to declare myself as a Jew at moments like that.
Yeah. So this next question is from Joshua, who asked the question earlier about law in the Torah. And he's wanting to know if there was ever a moment when you were working in the White House where you were faced with a task that contradicted your values as a Jewish person.
Right. No, never. And in fact, a variation I get on this question often is like, what do you do if you disagree with the person you're writing for? And my answer is I don't. I'm very selective about who I work for, because when I'm speech writing for someone, that's not just like a writing exercise. I'm not a copywriter. I am helping them to promote certain policies and values and ideas. And I have to believe fully in those policies, values, and ideas, or else I feel like what I would be doing to me would be unethical. Like I wouldn't be able to sleep at night. I wouldn't be comfortable with myself. I can think of one example, like in the first job I happened to work, the person who I was working for, she was in favor of the death penalty. I'm strongly against the death penalty. She came from a family that had been a victim of numerous crimes. And she came by her opinion honestly. I strongly disagreed, as did my boss, who was her speechwriter. And he had an agreement with her that if she were ever to talk about the death penalty, he wouldn't write it for her. She would have to kind of be on her own. And look, it was not an issue she actually talked about.
Right.
She certainly never did when I was there. But, you can, if there's one issue that, one relatively small issue that you disagree with on someone, you can certainly carve that out. But I think if you're getting to a space where it's like, you have a fundamental disagreement on values, then I think you're writing for the wrong person. So for me, I never felt like there was a conflict. Did I sometimes disagree with how someone I was writing for wanted to say something? Sure. And I would just tell them that, and they could take my feedback or not. But yeah, no, the ethical alignment was really important to me.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like if you're striving to be an ethical person or live a certain sort of ethic, that it's a career you can do in a value neutral way.
It's really not. I mean, political speechwriters especially, it's really, you kind of pick a side and go with it. So I think when you're looking at corporate speechwriters, it becomes a little bit different, because, if you're working at a car company, it's like, it's a little bit different. You might be working, your boss at the car company might be a Democrat and you might be a Republican, but if you're comfortable with what the company is doing in the world and your boss is not going around talking about their politics, then it's probably okay, right? It's sort of like, what are you actually writing about? What are you actually promoting with your speech writing?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So this next question is from Eileen. And she would like to ask you, from a Jewish perspective, what your advice is for the young generation of women who are trying to get started in the tech and engineering community, which is commonly and primarily dominated by men. What kind of advice would you have from a Jewish perspective? So I think what she's asking here, which I'm sure you get, is that, what's kind of your position on issues of gender, and how has Judaism informed that, especially given many of the faces that women, many of the challenges that women are faced with in the workforce today?
Yeah. It's funny, like, if you look back 2,000 years to these ancient rabbis, their views reflected the views of the time about women. And that certainly did shape Jewish law back then. With our interpretive process, I think we've come to realize, oh, that doesn't make sense anymore, right? That doesn't make sense to not have women be rabbis. We've sort of reinterpreted it. And, I think that was the result of a lot of people just pushing for it, right? Just saying, hey, wait a second, this isn't right. Like, we have a place here. This doesn't make sense anymore. This is not reflecting our kind of beating heart values. And, something so I think it's like, when you are a woman in this kind of male dominated industry, which I can imagine is very challenging, right? It is not easy to be the one or the two women in the room. It really, I don't know, that can create a culture that is really uncomfortable. So I just think it's just so important to remember that you belong there, right? And that, the kind of pushing you're doing, the struggle you're going through, which I know is so tough, you are absolutely paving the way for other women. Like, I think about the first female rabbi. This was, I don't know, 50 years ago, maybe in the US. Other countries went earlier, but this woman, she was the one rabbi, right? The one Jewish rabbi in America. I mean, how lonely must that have been, right? How hard must that have been? How much doubt must there have been to people around her? And now rabbinical schools in America, the vast majority of them have more women than men as students, right? And so she had to be that first voice. She had to be that first person. And I think about that in politics as well. Hillary Clinton, when she ran in 2008, she just got so much. Every other question was like, can a woman run for president? What does it mean that you're running as a woman? All this stuff, just maddening. And then, I look in 2016 and Elizabeth Warren's running in the primary, and Amy Klobuchar and Kristen Gillibrand, all these women, Kamala Harris, and no one said anything. It wasn't even a question. Of course a woman can run for president. When she was nominated as vice president, it just wasn't a thing. It was like, oh, what a wonderful historical moment. There was no like, oh, can a woman do it? And so it is hard to have to be the one who's breaking that glass ceiling, right? That is not easy. And I think it's very lonely. But I think the more that you can reach out to other women who are doing the same thing, the better. If there are university associations of women in science and engineering, women in STEM, I think being parts of those communities is just so hugely helpful. So you can actually share best practices, you can get support, and you can, just to be really nitty gritty, you can network, right? You can help each other find jobs and really create your own old girls network in that space. And then you can start mentoring students who come after you. So it is not easy, but what you're doing, it is so important. And in 20 or 30 years, I guarantee, because of what you're doing, you will come back as an alum and be like, look at all these women. I can't believe how many women are in this program. And that will be because you did the work.
And we're seeing that, and I want to ask you as a follow-up question here, we're seeing that happen in the Orthodox community to some extent.
Exactly.
I generally have my nose in books and in materials from the ancient world, but I do know that, was it 2016 or 17, an Orthodox synagogue in New Jersey or somewhere out east hired a woman rabbi,
Yes.
which stirred lots of controversy. And I think
an Orthodox woman, right? There's now an Orthodox rabbinical school for women. They've
Okay,
actually,
yeah, so that was going to be my question. Do you know what the
yeah,
current kind of state of the debate is in the Orthodox
yeah. So
community?
it's you know, there is a school that ordains Orthodox women as clergy. Well, first of all, I should just say all non-Orthodox schools have been ordaining women for decades. It's, there are tons of women rabbis, more female rabbinical students. It's funny, it's sort of a new debate in the Orthodox community, which is just much more traditional. So there is a relatively new school that ordains women as Orthodox clergy. It is somewhat controversial in some of the Orthodox world, but there are now clergy who've graduated, Orthodox women who are now serving as spiritual leaders, clergy, rabbis in a number of synagogues. And, it's pretty exciting, right, to see them breaking that boundary. And they still adhere to all of the gender rules in Orthodoxy, right? They're very rigorous about continuing to follow those. So there are certain things that they don't do that a male rabbi would, which I don't love that. That's sort of a little bit of frustration I have with it, but they're Orthodox. So they continue to observe those rules. And I actually know a number of women who are graduates of that school, and they are extraordinary. I mean, they are just utterly brilliant. Some of the best rabbis and teachers you will ever meet. And so it's just very exciting to me. And I think that's going to become more and more mainstream. I think it'll be more and more accepted in the Orthodox world. And it's such a great thing. It's so exciting to see.
Yeah, yeah. So this next question that I have queued up here shifts gears a little bit, and it does ask about the current U.S. president and his particular approach to speeches. But it's a really good question, I think. So I'll just read it because it's rather detailed. But if you need me to repeat anything, just let me know. But this is from Pat. And Pat asks, the current president often speaks in a way that comes off as being incredibly casual or off the cuff. And Pat says, the colloquial feel to him as a lay person is such a degree that he wonders how much of this speech is actually written by speechwriters like yourself. Do you have any thoughts on Trump's particular style of speech and and maybe some insider knowledge on what's going on in the background there? This is a good part of this. He says, are the speechwriters, if there are any, that good in terms of mimicking his style or finding his voice, as you talked about earlier? Or is there something else going on here with our outgoing commander-in-chief?
These are excellent questions. Just in the interest of just being totally transparent, I know a number of speechwriters and other staffers from the Bush administration, and I adore them, right? They're lovely people. One of them is a mentor of mine. A bunch of them are dear friends. I've been on panels with them. We disagree on a lot of policy issues quite strongly, but I really respect them. And I know a lot about their process, and, they're just excellent writers and have a very good process, and, very similar actually to the Obamas. Trump, I don't know anyone who's worked in the Trump White House, which is unusual. It is a very, don't know any of them. It's a very different group of people. I think once in a while he does have scripted speeches, which he kind of reads from a teleprompter, and you can kind of tell because he's a little bit more stilted and kind of halting. But I think oftentimes when you're seeing him, I think it probably is largely off the cuff. There may be a speech in the teleprompter, there may be something on the podium, but he does seem to just be kind of talking off the cuff. Look, I actually think he is one of the most authentic politicians in our history. Nothing about him is hidden. There's nothing about him you don't know. He's a very simple person. He's very transparent. He doesn't really have a lot of capacity to hide he doesn't have much of a theory of mind. Like, he's a very basic human being. And so what you see is what you get with him. And so, but authentic is different from being honest, right? You have to understand those are two very different things. Like, he's really authentically a pathological liar. He's authentically cruel and corrupt and abusive and narcissistic. It's all just laid out for you. It's not like that's all deep and hidden and he's putting on a kind face or he's reading polite speeches. He's sort of almost done us the courtesy of letting us know exactly who he is. So that authenticity, I actually think it's incredibly powerful, because unfortunately, American politicians have this habit of speaking in these kind of scripted sound bites, that like their pollster told them, say the middle class America's hardworking dream. I mean, it's like, no one talks this way as a normal person, and it's actually quite condescending. And I think a lot of Americans got really sick of it. And then they have this guy who just seems so authentic, and that's quite appealing. And I think, the Obamas too were authentic, and it was really appealing. Like, he won these elections, he won this 2 elections by quite a lot of votes. And again, that was his authenticity, right? You saw him, he didn't hide things either. You saw his decency, his integrity, his, his intelligence, and sometimes his annoyance at, stupid things that were happening, which I really, frankly, appreciated about him. So that it's sort of 2 sides of the same coin. But the authenticity has won him a lot of support, and it's something that I find quite terrifying. So I think he does. I remember reading that he has like a team of speechwriters. I'm not totally clear on what they do, but they probably do provide some scripting, and it doesn't seem to be used a lot.
Given his track record with the White House staff and the cabinet, first of all, it doesn't surprise me that you don't know anyone there with the revolving door that it's been. But
a lot of turnover there.
Yeah,
a lot of turnover.
Very interesting. Anyway,
it's interesting. The Obama White House, there were a lot of us who were there for all 8 years, which is crazy, because half our speechwriting team was there for all 8 years, which is very unusual, because the typical White House tenure is more like 18 months to 2 years because it's such an intense job. But the Obamas are great. And I think just the number of staff who stuck with them for all 8 years, it tells you a lot. It tells you a lot about them as people or as bosses. There is no one else I can imagine having worked for 8 years in that White House.
Yeah. Speaking of the juxtaposition between the current administration and the past, this next question gets at that as well. And this is actually from Joseph Wiebe, who's my religious studies colleague here, professor at the U of A. And he says that the image that you mentioned of underprivileged children running around the White House like they own the place is striking, especially when it's juxtaposed with images of kids being torn from their families under ICE and recent challenges with immigration and so on during the current administration. And he asks, does the presence of religion or importance of religious values in the White House make a difference between the 2 administrations, do you think, in their approaches to vulnerable communities in our society?
Yeah, it's funny. It depends on what you mean by religion. I think one of my greatest frustrations with modern American life is that the loudest religious voices in our national conversation are the most hateful, the ugliest, the most bigoted, and frankly, the most stupid. They're the voices that say, God hates gay people. They're the voices that say, immigrants are rapists. And the voices that are just saying the ugliest things, and they're coming from people who identify a lot, there is a very loud sort of religious coalition in America that is saying things that I don't think reflect the true teachings of any religion. And I think that coalition has quite a hold on this White House. So, I guess you could technically say there are religious voices present in this White House. I find them deeply, I find that they kind of step on the beating heart of any decent religious tradition. So, but, I think about the religious voices that were present in the Obama White House, and it was just these voices of faith that would say, like, our mission is to help those who are on the outside, those who are struggling, the least among us. It was this sense of real, it was like nuns on the bus, right? These amazing nuns who, went around trying to promote the Affordable Care Act because they passionately believe that every human being has a right to healthcare, right? Like, it's like that kind of religion. It's the kind of religion that talks about racial justice and racial equality as a fundamental issue of faith. It's the kind of religion that says, like, gay people are God's children too, and of course they should be able to get married. I think that kind of religion was quite popular in the Obama White House, right? There were a lot of my colleagues had faith traditions that shaped their ethical values in that way, including the president and first lady. So I think you saw a lot of that kind of religion in the White House. So technically they both had it. I would, I have a lot of doubts about the character of again, in quotations, the religion we're seeing now. I think, what we saw in the Obama White House, and frankly, in the Bush White House, even though I disagreed with a lot of their conclusions, it's certainly not my kind of religion, but, I would choose that over the Trump brand any day.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I should mention, so one of our questioners earlier, Debbie, who asked about your particular denominational affiliation or not, wanted to say that she's the daughter of a Reform rabbi and the great granddaughter and great niece of Orthodox rabbis, so she certainly understands the beauty of the pick and choose kind of method.
Yes, right.
She also wanted to thank you for your time and your thoughtful answers to your
Well,
questions.
thank you, Debbie, for those are great questions. I liked answering those.
Let me see. So there's lots of questions. I don't know that we will get to all of them, but let me kind of scroll through here. And
sure.
One of the audience members, Janessa, says that you mentioned how you reconnected with your heritage and how the laws and practices of Judaism opened your eyes. In some ways, are there certain laws from Judaism that are most influential in your life and influential in how you live your life, and why? So you mentioned some earlier about some of those ethical approaches or commands, but are there other kind of particular aspects or parts of Jewish law that really inform your life and that continue to do so?
Yeah, I mean, I think the ones we talked about earlier, around speech, how I use my speech, that's probably, I'm nowhere near actually following these laws, or I mess things up many times a day, but I'm much more aware of how I use my speech. The laws around Hesed, like this loving kindness presence, I'm much more, when someone is sick or in mourning or struggling, I'm just much more conscious of really being there for them, of understanding that just sending an email or a text, that's not enough. Right? It needs to be more fulsome presence. I also think, this isn't one specific law, but it's sort of an approach, and that is to theology in Judaism. Something I really appreciate about Judaism is that we have a kind of fundamental theological humility where there really isn't one clear dogma or definition or creed around God. I think there's this sort of sense of, what we're talking about is just so vast and infinite and so far beyond the scope of our tiny little human brains to possibly define or categorize, right? To say God is X, Y, or Z, it's almost in sort of a Jewish sense to be committing a kind of idolatry, because you're reducing something infinite to the limits of a human mind, which is kind of to create an idol almost. And so in Judaism, you don't really have systemic theology, like a clear definition of God. What you have is centuries and centuries of commentary and of people who are articulating different conceptions of God based on their understanding of Jewish tradition and their own lived experience. And that's just something I so appreciate, because I think for most of my life, I just assumed, well, I don't believe there's a separate being in the sky who controls everything and rewards and punishes us as we deserve. So I guess I have to be an atheist. Right? That was sort of my thinking, which that's not true. That's not true in any tradition, but it's especially untrue in Judaism, where there are just all these different conceptions and understanding of the divine. And even if you're an atheist, that's okay, because Judaism isn't just a religion. It is actually a peoplehood. I'm Jewish because I was born to Jewish parents, or because I convert to Judaism. That is what makes you Jewish. So, I can reject every single tenet of Jewish law, every single tenet of Jewish faith. I'm still Jewish because I was born to Jewish parents. So, again, I think that approach to theology and spirituality, that's something that has certainly shaped my life, because it has allowed me to explore spirituality, to kind of develop the spirituality that feels real to me, that doesn't feel like it's about belief. Right? It's not about me kind of believing something despite evidence to the contrary. It's much more about me developing an awareness of something greater, something that makes me feel a sense of awe and wonder and gratitude, and that my life has purpose, that I'm here for a reason. I don't know if I can be much more specific than that, but it's sort of opened the door to that kind of spiritual life, which I just find really helpful. And so that's, I think, something that's probably had the biggest influence on my life.
Yeah. And another plug for the book, your chapter on Jewish conceptions of divinity is really excellent. So
thank you.
Sarah has multiple small sections on different ways that Jewish thinkers and rabbis have thought about the concept of divinity, and it's very straightforward and, well, deep and straightforward at the same time. Like your section on Maimonides, I actually understood a bit. I was like, oh, maybe that's what he's trying to say.
That one was a hard one. It took me a while to just crack that nut. But yeah, and it's funny. A lot of people who are not Jewish, who are like other faith traditions, or who are atheists, have told me they really like the God chapter. They're just like, oh, these are conceptions of God that actually like, oh, we have an idea like that in Christianity or in, Islam, or like, oh, actually as a atheist, I kind of like this one. So it's like, oh, that's been
Yeah.
kind of interesting, because
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
we're all spiritual creatures in some way, but I think a lot of us are pushed away from it by language and definitions that just kind of put us off. So I think breaking down some of those barriers is helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. This question comes from the former dean of our campus, actually, Dr. Alan Berger. And he would like to know your thoughts about the dynamics of race in your particular position as a speechwriter, being a white person. How did you navigate that dynamic? How did you manage to write authentically for a Black president and a Black first lady, who often drew on their own histories and their own racial position in society and racialized position as the one giving the speeches?
Right. It's a great question. That is, this basically every speechwriter is different from their principal in some way, right? You're two separate people. And I think you're right. Michelle Obama and I are very different, right? She is Black, I am white. She's Christian, I'm Jewish. She came from a working class family. I came from a privileged family, right? We have very different backgrounds. And when she talks about how in her family education was like a religion, I'm like, were you living in my house? Like a lot of the ways she articulates her values, it actually sounds exactly what I would have described of my upbringing, which is interesting because our experiences in America are so dramatically different. And I think this really comes, this understanding and channeling the voice of someone who is of such a different background than you, who has had such a different experience in this country. That is where you get to the heart of the speechwriter's role, where it's like, it is not about emerging of voices. It's not about me kind of imposing anything on her. It's very much about that channeling. So I think the way you deal with that is by very, very careful listening, listening to the content, listening to the cadence of her voice. I would look at her edits very, very carefully and really internalize them, because she was giving me feedback. It was constant feedback. And it was about just being exquisitely attuned to that and being very aware that, like, I don't know, right? Like, I'm, something that might seem, there were times when she would say something, I'd be like, oh, I don't know if I would put it that way. But then I would realize, like, wait a second, this is her. It's not my place to say whether I'd put it that way or not. Like, this is coming from her. This is her voice, her experience. So I think it is that exquisite attunement and that listening that's really important. I also think, just in general, when you are writing for audiences that you are not a member of that audience, you need to do some real work, right, to really understand that audience. So, not just writing for a Black audience, which, she is Black. I think she has a really good sense of what that audience, the sensitivities around the audience, but, she spoke to audiences of Native American people, of Latinx people, of just all different races, ethnicities, backgrounds, religions. And I would spend a lot of time, at the front end of a speech talking to people from the audience. I would talk to the leader of the organization or the university or the institution and really say, like, okay, what's on people's minds? What are they struggling with? I would read their newsletter, their newspaper. I would ask, could you just put together a focus group of people from this audience? I mean, focus group is not the right term, but just put together a diverse group of people from this audience who I can talk to just to get to know them and to just get a sense of, like, what's on their minds and hearts. And then afterwards, once the speech was written, I would go out of my way to make sure to show it to various people who really knew the community, because you don't know what you don't know. And, like, it's so easy to get something wrong. It is so easy to be insensitive. It is so easy to just be off. And so it was very important, not just one person who knew the audience, but I often would show it to a number of people just to make sure, right? And if they flagged something, I listened. It was like, I gotta, that kind of humility and sensitivity. I think that's how I did it. But it was an ongoing work.
Yeah. That's really insightful. Thanks. I guess these things kind of, I guess, intuitively you should guess that writing a speech for a president or a first lady is a very involved, very long, very researched, very complex process. But it's not until you actually talk to someone who's done it for a career that you realize, I think, consciously how difficult and how complex that process could be. We have a few more minutes, and so we'll ask one more question because we don't want to wear Sarah out.
That's okay.
We return tomorrow, but we're coming to an end of our time here. But this is a good one to end on, and I apologize. Many questions came in. We weren't able to get to all of them, but that'll be hopefully maybe some encouragement to come tomorrow to hear more. Some of the questions that were asked that we didn't get to, we will get to tomorrow. But I want to end with this question from Meadow from the audience. She says that when you were talking about ethics in modern life, people can do what they want as long as it's not affecting others, which is, to be a good person, that's kind of a low standard or a low bar to set compared to Judaism, which you talked to. You've learned certain Jewish ethics have really raised the bar for you and pushed you to try to be a great person, not just a good person. So she wants to know, was there ever a time where you felt that you couldn't meet that bar, or where you've really struggled to meet those higher standards in the Jewish ethical principles that you've discovered?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think I've struggled in moments around speech, particularly, right? Like, I think there are moments where someone says, oh, can you give me your opinion on this person? Or, should I, I've been asked to speak at this event. What do you really think about this group? And it's a sort of awkward moment because maybe I have some doubts about this person or this group, but I also don't want to pass on gossip. I want to make sure, is this really well-founded? And I just don't want to say something that I regret, that hurts people, or that isn't fair, or that's maybe just one perspective when maybe I'm not right. So I've actually had moments where I've kind of overshared, where I've said too much. And then afterwards I thought, maybe I made a mistake there, right? Maybe I kind of sullied someone's reputation or said something wrong, even though I'd been asked to tell the truth. And Jewish ethical law actually has all these exceptions about how, if an employer calls you asking for a recommendation for an employee that you've had, it's okay to say the truth. It's okay to say negative things about someone for the purpose of reporting them because they're doing something unsafe or they're hurting you. I mean, there are all these exceptions, but, it's always a balancing act. There's never anything that's like perfectly cut and dried. I mean, I think Jewish law is a lot like common law in that you're basically reasoning from a lot of precedents. There's not some clear statutory answer. There is like, okay, well, in this situation, they did this, in this situation, that. How does this apply to your particular situation? And you're making judgment calls. And I've definitely gotten it wrong plenty of times. Yeah. I still kind of think about things that I said that I just really wish I hadn't. And that's something that, it's something I just work on kind of day after day.
Yeah, well, I think it's something we could all work on. I mean, as you say, sometimes you just want to share that thing with your partner, your colleague, whatever. And sometimes it's a true thing that you want to share, but it may also end up being a hurtful thing as that information spreads. And so, yeah, it's tough. We're all striving.
I am no model of this. No one should be modeling themselves after me. I'm.
Well, in any case, I really appreciate you sharing with us tonight and answering all of these good and tough questions and telling us some about your time in the White House and some of your journey to discovering Jewish ethics and Jewish theology and practice. And we'll come back to this tomorrow. As I said at the beginning, today we focused a bit more on your career in the White House and your work with the Obamas, and tomorrow we'll dive more into Judaism and certain issues within Judaism. So I will allow you to sign off. I'll say goodbye to you, Sarah, and we'll see you again tomorrow morning. And that will be my segue to share my screen here to make our announcement. So we'll see you soon.
Great, thank you so much.
I will share my screen, I think. Hopefully this will work. As I said, I'm no Zoom pro despite doing a fair bit of it. So just a reminder again, as I just said, we'll be joining, or Sarah will be joining us again tomorrow. That's Friday, 10 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. Grab yourself a coffee if you're in a coffee hour period, wherever you are. You can register at our website. You'll see it down there at the bottom of the screen, og.ualberta.ca/Ronning. And then also just a reminder as well to keep up with us on social media for announcements and so forth, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and then you can also join our mailing list on our website. Thank you again, everyone. Thank you again to Kim Wiebe for all of her help setting this up, and have a good evening. and I'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow.